Has Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez found the love of her life? We don't know. That's not the topic of today's show. Maybe she has, maybe she hasn't. Not sorry to disappoint anybody who was hoping for that, but she has found an ally, which, of course, we always knew as an ally, but she seems a bit reluctant to still admit it. In Nick Fuentes, the famous white supremacist, they are united, as we've seen in other countries, and as again as we know, united in their common hatred of the Jews, their common opposition to Israel, if that's how they want to put it. But they're united in the opposition to Israel and in the reasons for it. So this recent news is that after a tweet by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Nick Fuentes replied to her, and let's shall we read the tweet, Morgan? Let's start with, so she's responding to a tweet or a post about um, the cost of elections, how much candidates spend on ads, and the fact that an APAC affiliated group in one congressional district in New York has spent 61% of the money spent there. And her tweet was, and I'm quoting, "An unspoken secret in Congress is that much of the reflexive, blind, unconditional vote support for nearly any Israeli government action isn't from actual agreement. It's from fear. Reps are terrified of this," pointing to the tweet she's responding to, "of APAC. So they don't vote their conscience, they vote their fear." Now, everything about this tweet is kind of classic anti-Semitism. The Jews are, buying people up. There's nobody actually wants to support them, but they're afraid of the Jews who control everything. And then Nick Fuentes quoted that tweet and said, "AOC is more America first than 99% of Republicans." Now, she responded to that saying to him, "You are a white supremacist, and I want nothing to do with you, nor the world you imagine. I believe in a multiracial democracy, one of economic rights, civil liberties, and that affirms the working class and the rights of women and LGBTQ plus people. These are not small differences." So even in her response, trying to distance herself from Nick Fuentes, she makes it clear by not bringing it up that, yeah, we have our disagreements. This is not one of them. Israel, of course, she wouldn't put it as the Jews, but yeah, we can read between the lines, even though we were some of us educated in government schools. It's not that difficult in this case. Uh, I'm joined by Morgan. Welcome to the day. I haven't done this for a while. Welcome to the Daily Objective. I'm joined by Morgan. Morgan, your thoughts on this?
Well, it's in a small way, it's amusing in the sense that I think clearly she wasn't looking for this kind of endorsement, and is clearly quite frustrated that she's received it. Now, beyond the individual people there, I think really what you can see in this is a broader kind of representative trend on the left and right nowadays, more than just these two people. And there is some nuance with AOC, I'll say. She did make a tweet condemning anti-Semitism recently. Now, maybe that's just a bit paltry hand waving, but Nick Fuentes is certainly a much more open and sort of virulent anti-Semite. And I agree very much that the tweet that she made there has very much the kind of overtones of the kind of anti-Semitism that you see from even from people like Nick Fuentes talking about kind of conspiratorial power being wielded, politicians being under the sway of Israel, politicians being afraid of Israel, that kind of thing. But Fuentes is a bit more of the really nasty case. But the fact that they actually do have this kind of similarity or even union, and the fact that even she doesn't necessarily realize that or seems a bit uncomfortable about it, I think is indicative of a real problem on the left and on the right. The left and the right don't both have their kind of way in which they can be anti-Israel, but also that they can lean into anti-Semitism. Even though people on the left, like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. I suspect she would, think she could never be anti-Semitic and generally wouldn't think of herself that way, and yet can still fall into these kind of tropes and ways of thinking, which are very typical of anti-Semitism. So I think it's an interesting interaction, and people should pay attention to it.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark, for becoming a YouTube member. Thank you, Equal to Reality, for gifting a membership. Davy Boy mentions for some time now, David Duke has also been supporting the Palestinian narrative. And yeah, so we see this all the time. We saw this in the UK a few months ago and talked about it, how there was a by-election. George Galloway, who is one of the most famous anti-Israel and most dedicated anti-Israel activists in this country. So George Galloway ran for Congress in that by-election, won, and had publicly the support of Nick Griffin of the British National Party. The British National Party, for people who don't know, is until fairly recently, maybe 10, 15 years ago, a whites only party. You could not join the party if you were not white. And this was under Nick Griffin. The reason that changed was because the court forced them to change it. They forced them to accept non-white. So it's as clearly a white supremacist party as possible. And of course for him it was easy to support George Galloway, because George Galloway's main cause is to support those people who happen to also be dedicated to the cause of exterminating the Jews. And so this is, for us, it's never surprising when the right, the more ideological right and the more ideological left meet. I don't know if it's in the middle, but meet wherever it is. And we've covered it on different topics as well. We've talked about how Tucker Carlson has been using Marxist language for many years, attacking Amazon for exploiting their workers and so on. It seems surprising to them. By the way, Morgan, it seems to me like it's easier for those on the right to admit this than those on the left. I think on the left, you're expected to automatically hate anybody who's not of the left, and proudly so. And so in this case, it's Nick Fuentes who's let's call it less dishonest. Your thoughts on that?
You mean that it's more someone like Fuentes on the right is more willing to see, or more able to see the commonality with the left? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and I mean here we had Nick Griffin endorse George Galloway. I don't know if George Galloway ever responded to that, but it would be much more surprising to see George Galloway endorse Nick Griffin because they both hate the Jews, or however they put it.
Sure. I think maybe because the far right are much more ostracized than the far left, because I think AOC is much more of a far left figure, and yet she's almost like a mainstream politician in lots of ways. So I think for someone like Fuentes on the far right, they're much more willing to kind of try and gain that maybe legitimacy or esteem by trying to reach out to someone who's in the mainstream like that. And that's why Cortez, aside from the ideological reasons, is probably kind of pushing back against it just, quite so much. But there was something else that you asked as well, which has completely slipped my mind now.
Well, it slipped my mind as well. So whatever it is, if we remember it, let me read the super chats and see if that refreshes our memory. Thank you, Akira, for the super chat. Akira says, I've been seeing more anti-Jew conservatives lately. Yeah, I mean, they've always been there. We live in a time since October 7th where it's much easier to be openly anti-Jew, of course, with the way the war is covered and the way politicians are choosing to deal with that war. It's kind of legitimized in a sense, but we saw people celebrating on the streets on October 7th, and from that moment it kind of I think anti-Semitism increased. So yeah, it's not surprising to see it, obviously, on both the left and the right, whatever that means. Thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. Thank you, John, for the super chat. John says, talk about an unholy alliance. Yeesh. And welcome back, Razi. Thank you, John. I don't know if you could notice, I'm kind of not fully back. This is a jet lag episode, but luckily it's not one of the more difficult topics to talk about. These people, are not it's not a serious intellectual analysis that's needed here. More pointing to things that are kind of clearly there. And yeah, Morgan, what do you remember what the previous point was?
I guess just that I think, why is it that someone like Cortez, who doesn't think of herself as anti-Semitic, I don't think I'd be very surprised if she sort of secretly, um, consciously thought it through that she was anti-Semitic and she really had a problem with the Jews. Why is that she's able to fall into this? I think it's because that she is fundamentally a collectivist, like Nick Fuentes. Why is she vulnerable to this? It's not because she has a loyalty to an individualistic way of looking at the world and to judging people individually. She's very much focused on group dynamics, as is Nick Fuentes. And what their real disagreement about is the groups over which they want to focus on. Even in her response, what she says is she talks about wanting to put a focus on the working class, multiracial democracy, and so on. So she doesn't agree with having the focus on racial exclusivity of white people like Nick Fuentes does, but she does want to talk about economic classes and those kind of groups. And that's a really shallow difference. That's not fundamentally this huge dividing line between them, although they might think and feel like it is. So the fact that people on the left and the right are able to find this kind of union, it can look a bit strange, but I think people need to appreciate that both sides of the political spectrum at the moment are really collectivistic. And that's why you're able to see these kind of strange bedfellows coming together, even if they're doing so a bit reluctantly.
Yeah, and even though it kind of contradicts what I just said in response to John's super chat, yeah, the intellectual analysis part of this is the fact that this is on philosophical fundamentals. Kind of the deeper you go into the ideas that underlie their political views, the easier it is to see the so-called left and the so-called right converge. Yeah, the idea, their common war is against the individual, and we've seen so many times throughout history how different totalitarian or totalitarian wannabe factions work together. We see it with the Palestinians as well. We've talked about how there is disagreement among the Palestinians. It's just not when it comes to killing the Jews. That's a consensus, but the disagreements about what kind of totalitarian regime we want there between Hamas and the PLO has been around forever and has, of course, like that disagreement has included actual, I wouldn't call it war, but fighting and killing each other. So, and we saw it in Iran. We didn't see it because it was before our time, but it happened in Iran when the communists fought alongside the Islamists to overthrow the Shah, succeeded in that, and then weren't too happy with what came after. Of course, we saw it in Nazi Germany as well in the early days. So yeah, fundamentally the differences are minor, and when you get into specific really minutia of if you have collectivist totalitarianism, it doesn't really matter which kind. It matters a little bit in the sense that, if you're a Jew under these people, you might be first to go, but nobody will actually benefit from it. And yeah, one thing I'm not sure I agree with you on is does she think of herself as anti-Semitic? Maybe she wouldn't put it that way, but I do think she probably looks at, because she does look at collectives rather than individuals. I think the collective of the Jews is one she is likely to somewhat consciously view negatively.
It's certainly possible. I'm just trying to recognize maybe to some degree she's not as consciously anti-Semitic as Nick Fuentes, but yeah, it's quite, you're quite possibly right. And as for her, I was saying this goes beyond her a bit and is more representative of a problem on the left. If you're looking at the tweet that she made, if people go look at her Twitter account or her X account, just below it or near it is a tweet from Bernie Sanders, who's saying something quite similar to what she says in her quote and in her tweet. It isn't quite as conspiratorially worded, but it's not a million miles away. And it's about AIPAC as well. And again, Fuentes in I think in his second response to her, he points out that someone like Sanders agrees with him and with her, and that there is this kind of union there. Now, I suspect he's sort of tweaking her nose and is enjoying winding her up because she's, she hits back quite angrily. And clearly his fans, if you go and look at the responses as well, are really enjoying that there's any kind of interaction there. But he, as much as I don't want to credit him with anything, Fuentes is really noticing and pointing out something that's real and something that a lot of people miss, which is this similarity and the fact that Bernie Sanders as well is hitting on something very common here. So yeah, although I think it's a good thing for us, for most of us who don't want to live in these collectivistic dictatorships, that the far right and the far left actually do, oppose each other over their sort of factionalist minutiae, and they don't unite over their common fundamentals. People should still notice that those fundamentals are there.
Yeah. By the way, we also, I think we talked about the similarities back in 2020 when this show launched. The first episode was titled "The Riots," I believe, and this was around the Black Lives Matter riots. They share racism as a common view. They just don't necessarily agree on which race they're fighting for, which race they're fighting against. So you mentioned she had a tweet about against anti-Semitism. This was something to do with the video, right? This was to do with
I've
the
got it
film.
here if you want me to read it
Yeah,
out.
sure. Yeah, that'll be.
So she said, the callousness, dehumanization, and targeting of Jews on display at last night's protest outside the Nova Festival exhibit was atrocious anti-Semitism, plain and simple. Anti-Semitism has no place in our city, nor any broader movement that centers human dignity and liberation.
Yeah, so I think, that's kind of one of the easier ones, or on the other hand, one of the more difficult ones that it would be to defend. So AOC, I believe she was one of the Congress people who went to Columbia University and met with the protesters there, and met also with that guy who said all Zionists should be killed and then got expelled for it, and congratulated him on his work. So, where there's plausible deniability, oh, I didn't hear that, I wasn't following. I'm just generally I'm generally supportive of a mostly peaceful protest, or however they want to put it. She'll take that. Yeah, if she actually sided with protesters outside, a screening of a film just about the fact that Jews were slaughtered for being Jews. That's a position that even for her would be a bit more difficult to take, I think, and defend publicly.
Yes, I agree. But if you look at the responses to this tweet that she made condemning this, a lot of her fans aren't very pleased that she did that. A lot of them tweet in response and say, "Oh, looks like she forgot about all her APAC money that's coming in," or "Looks like she got a visit from the APAC babysitter," right? So there's quite a bit of that coming through. And so for people who view her as, really sticking it to the Israelis, they're not happy to see her condemn anti-Semitism. I think people should pay attention to those kind of things because it puts the lie to the whole ironclad separation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, really, because this is the American-Israeli, was it Public Affairs Committee, whatever. It isn't the American-Jewish, per se. Now, obviously, AIPAC is going to concern itself with anti-Semitism and so on, that it's not 100% divorced. But for these people, the fact that it's the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, that has a lot of baked in weight and meaning for them. And the fact that all this kind of anti-Zionism brings up all of the kind of tropes and imagery of anti-Semitism. It is not an accident, it's cause and effect. And yet lots of people want to kind of ignore that that's there. But people should see that this, if you just take out the word Zionism and put in Jews, this is all the same kind of complaints, this is the same kind of prejudice, this is the same kind of agitation.
El Rito says in the chat, hope we can see the day where one's race is as politically important as the color of your hair or one's height. And so far, I understand there's only one race of human. Yeah, well, I agree with the second part. I agree with all of it. I just think we're unfortunately it's not likely to happen anytime soon. I think we're probably moving more towards the point where the color of your hair will matter more politically than it does at the moment. Because yeah, look, racism is on the rise on both sides, and again, this war, one of the many cultural effects it has had is to legitimize one specific form of bigotry, which is anti-Semitism, and to what once you do that, you further kind of the cause of collectivism overall a lot more, and I think more collectivists will feel empowered, so to speak, to take their collectivist positions. I think yeah, to move towards that world that we all want to see is going to take a lot, but that's why we're here.
For sure. And, it's disheartening looking at politics in recent years because the collectivists are dominating um, very, very much. I sometimes try and take heart that when I was a kid, I think it still felt to me like the individualistic way of looking at the world was the one that was taken as granted. Now, not in the full principled kind of philosophical sense, but in the idea that you would judge an individual, for their own character that they've shaped rather than group identity. I think a lot of that is still fundamentally there in the culture. Now, the culture is kind of mixed and clashing, but that element is still there. So it's not, all is not completely lost. We just need to, when we're trying to convince people, you can often couch these things in ways that appeal to that fundamental assumption that people still take it as reasonably self-evident. And you need to point out how that clashes with the collectivistic way of looking at the world that they've probably picked up along the way as well. So there are ways of doing this.
Yeah, there's elements I think in the Palestinian cause, so to speak, that make it attractive. Other than the hatred of Jews, that make it attractive to collectivists. It is a very collectivistic society and very violent society, which I think ultimately you have that underlying desire for violence in all these movements. Again, I think this is where the Nick Fuentes white supremacist so-called right is less dishonest than the left, but the left does this wherever again, if you go congratulate protesters who are committing violent acts and are intimidating students just for the fact that they're Jews, then it's there, and it's clearly it works hand in hand with the people that you're supporting. Of course, depending on who you ask, there are also justifications by more and more of those justifications by the pro-Palestinian side for specific, even for the rape and for the fact, there's the whole about the music festival. Well, why were they doing it in right in front of the oppressors? Were having a music festival right next to the oppressed. There's there's it's it's not difficult once you give up, I think, reason to go with whatever it is that you have to go with to justify your cause. And of course, they constantly use moralistic language, and the moralistic language resonates because unfortunately collectivism is the widely accepted moral view in the Western world today.
Sure. And I think the interesting part of what Fuentes said, which we haven't quite touched on, but this is the other element of similarity, is when he's responding to AOC's response to him, they go back and forth. He says, but one of the things we are united on is opposing the genocide of Palestinians. Now, I think that's an interesting thing because I could believe that people on the left have sort of whipped themselves up so much that they might sort of in their own minds be convinced there's a genocide going on, no matter how implausible that really is. It's a stranger thing to see Fuentes saying that. And it's I'm trying to figure it out exactly what parts of that. Is this just because this is a talking point to bash Israel on? Is this because he wants to use that to kind of bridge the divide again? Or is he somehow as well also whipped up and genuinely believing this. I'm not really sure. My instinct is to say that it puts the lie to that whole perspective, that the idea that he could also believe that there's a genocide of Palestinians going on, or that he would really care about that he would think there's a real problem with that. That wouldn't strike me as something he would deeply hold and believe. But what did you think, Razi, when you saw him also coming out, against the genocide going on?
I don't know that I read that much into it. I mean, so many of what the pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinian side does is just use slogans, and some of the those of them who can form whole sentences will give some explanation of why it's a genocide, but it's what the point here, I think, is the fact that these views are very popular generally among influencers, let's say, not in the necessarily, way it's commonly used nowadays, but people with influence everywhere. Ironically, considering that the original AOC tweet basically says it's the Jews who have all the influence, but no, if you look not just in politics, although in politics this is widespread as well, but you look in the media, you look at how things are reported. To the point, I wasn't on any of the shows where we talked about the rescued hostages, but the fact that that was reported in the way it was reported, as look at all these people who died. Why didn't Israel notify them that they're going to go and release the hostages? I mean, the unbelievable things that people let themselves get away with when they're so committed to that cause, rather than I think honest reporting on this would have been, Israel actually took some action militarily that was done in generally the right way, the way you should fight a war, which it hasn't done so far in the past 9 months. And the fact that many Palestinians died, the fact that those videos I saw, those videos of Palestinians, filming the bombing, running scared. The fact that that isn't viewed generally as a good thing. I mean, the great thing is the hostages were rescued. The added bonus was Palestinians who celebrated on the same streets on October 7th are now running terrified on those streets, and some of them are dying on those streets. Why wasn't that reported as a positive? No, that what we heard was yeah, hostages were rescued, but at what cost? Well, at a cost. The cost there was the life of an Israeli soldier. That was the cost that really makes this an issue, where questions should be asked. But the idea again of the cost being the cost to the people who did October 7th, the people who celebrated October 7th, to report it that way, you need to have that kind of underlying fundamental philosophical view that I think Nick Fuentes, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and many on the right and left share, and more of them, the more ideological you get on both sides.
Yes, I think there is certainly something off about it. I think it'd be hard to get people onto the perspective of seeing the deaths as a good thing. But certainly what I find interesting is that people who sort of are complaining about, what was it, 4 hostages were saved, but 271 supposedly Palestinians were killed. They will consider themselves as the more compassionate side. The people who are in favor of the Israeli hostages being saved are very callous. They don't care. And yet the kind of mindset these people are on is just tossing up numbers. Oh, so 4 were saved and 271 or thereabouts were killed. Therefore, the logic seems to be something like there's a disparity in the numbers, although that I doubt they would actually believe this. The implication seems to be if there were a bit more parity in the numbers, then there would be something more kind of legitimate. And yet, really, their whole attitude is one of immense callousness towards the hostages, who did absolutely nothing. They want to say that the civilians aren't involved at all. And if you concede that for the purposes of conversation, the hostages haven't done anything either. But why do you view those lives as able to be disposed of quite so callously as they do? And I think despite them wanting to clothe themselves in the banner of compassion, I think there really is a callousness towards the hostages, and we've seen that all over the place. When you see their posters being torn down, and the way people really don't want to talk about the hostages. There's an amazing callousness towards the lives of the hostages and towards Israeli soldiers, as you say.
Yeah, and of course, when you say civilians weren't involved, if there are children who were killed in an Israeli attack as part of this war, they're not involved. But of course, we know that the civilians were involved in holding the hostages, still are involved. The hostages were rescued from the home of a doctor, and yeah, they're involved everywhere. In a few days, we're going to do an episode of the reality show talking about um, what the hostages who were either released in the deal back in November, or and the ones that were rescued, what they have been saying about their experience. But a little spoiler is that, yeah, many of them were held by families, were moved from family to family. Uh, people the civilian population in Gaza is as involved as they're able to be in the atrocities that started on October 7th and are continuing every moment in Gaza against these hostages. I also had another point, but I don't remember it, so maybe we will. Yeah, jet lag is it makes it difficult to think, and but by tomorrow, hopefully, I'll get some sleep. Tomorrow, we are talking about um the latest pearls of wisdom from Antonio Gutierrez, the really evil Secretary General of the United Nations. His latest was to say, to blame Israel for the fact that aid isn't getting to the Palestinians, but while blaming Israel, he does note that most trucks are looted, and that is also Israel's fault. So yeah, that's kind of a continuation of today's episode, because the blame the Jews for everything theme is going to be the theme of this weekend's daily objective. Any parting thoughts, Morgan?
No, I think you got it. But also, we have the reality show extra coming up tomorrow, where we're going to be talking about the British election, right?
Yeah, and we're talking specifically about the brain drain, because that's been in the news in recent days. The brain drain from the UK, not just the brain drain, the wealth drain, the people with money leaving this country under the Conservative Party, and we are less than 2 weeks away from Labour winning likely the largest majority ever, or at least in a long time, and let's see what happens there. I don't know if you saw this, but there was a Guardian open letter in the Guardian to the rich, saying basically goodbye and good riddance. So we might talk about that. That's it's always interesting. It's one of those things that collectivists say, and then when it actually happens, don't always like the results of it. But anyway, thanks everybody for joining us today. By the way, that episode of the reality show extra is available to all members, YouTube members as well. So we have 2 new ones from today's show. But if you were watching this recorded, you can always become a member in time for tomorrow's show. Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.
Bye bye.